You should start packing soon, Margaret. This house won't really be yours anymore. Emily Whitmore said it quietly in the kitchen, only hours after the funeral guests had left, as if she were discussing something as ordinary as rearranging furniture instead of the life of the woman who had lived in that house for 42 years. Margaret Whitmore stood by the window overlooking the wide backyard where the old maple tree still leaned slightly to the left, just the way her husband Thomas used to joke about every autumn. The evening sun stretched long shadows across the grass, and for a moment Margaret said nothing at all. She simply folded the dish towel in her hands with careful precision. The silence made Emily uncomfortable, though she tried not to show it. In the living room, Daniel Whitmore sat heavily on the sofa, scrolling through his phone as if exhaustion from the day's events had drained any interest he might have had in the conversation happening just a few steps away. Earlier that morning, dozens of people had gathered to say goodbye to Thomas Whitmore, a man who had built a successful manufacturing company from a modest garage workshop and spent most of his life believing that family would always remain the center of everything he worked for. Flowers still lined the hallway table, sympathy cards stacked neatly beside them. Yet the house already felt different, as though a quiet shift had taken place beneath its familiar walls. Emily stepped closer to the counter, lowering her voice even further. She spoke with the careful tone of someone pretending to be practical rather than impatient. Daniel and I were thinking it might be easier for everyone if you considered a smaller place, she said. This property is a lot to manage, and after everything that's happened, it just makes sense. Margaret slowly turned from the window. Her expression remained calm, almost distant, the way it had been all day while relatives offered condolences and distant cousins speculated softly about the future of the Whitmore estate. None of them realized that Margaret had already spent the previous night sitting alone in Thomas's study, reviewing a set of documents that very few people even knew existed. She remembered the way Thomas had looked at her months earlier, his voice steady as he explained every detail, insisting that some truths were better revealed only when the right moment arrived. Now that moment had not yet come. Margaret looked briefly toward Daniel, who still hadn't raised his eyes from his phone, then back at Emily, who waited expectantly for an answer that would confirm her quiet assumptions about the future. Instead, Margaret simply placed the folded towel on the counter and offered a small, polite smile that revealed nothing. The truth was that on the day her husband passed away, Margaret Whitmore had chosen not to mention the $28 million quietly secured in a private trust. And she certainly said nothing about who actually controlled it. Margaret Whitmore woke before sunrise the next morning, the way she had for most of her adult life, even though the house was unusually quiet now. The early light filtered through the kitchen curtains, casting pale gold across the wooden table where she and Thomas had shared coffee almost every morning for more than 4 decades. She moved slowly, placing a kettle on the stove and setting out 2 cups before catching herself and returning one of them to the cabinet. The habit lingered even when the person was gone. Outside, the neighborhood in Hartford was still calm, the wide suburban street lined with tall oak trees and large brick homes that had once symbolized the success Thomas worked so hard to build. Margaret sat down with her coffee and opened the morning newspaper, but her eyes never truly followed the articles. Instead, she listened to the faint sounds upstairs where Emily and Daniel had stayed overnight after the funeral. Their voices began drifting down the hallway about an hour later, quiet at first, then clearer as they moved toward the staircase. Emily sounded energetic in a way that felt strangely out of place for a morning so close to loss. She spoke about real estate listings, property taxes, and renovation costs, as if she had already stepped into the role of decision-maker. Daniel responded with short sentences that suggested agreement more than reflection. When they entered the kitchen, Margaret greeted them politely, her tone gentle and steady. Emily offered a sympathetic smile that lasted only a moment before she began discussing practical matters again. She mentioned the size of the house, the maintenance bills, and how overwhelming such responsibilities could be for someone living alone. She said it might be wise to start looking at retirement. Communities outside the city where services were easier and the lifestyle was quieter. Margaret listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as if considering the suggestion with sincere thought. Daniel poured himself coffee and leaned against the counter, avoiding direct eye contact with his mother, while Emily continued explaining how selling the Whitmore property could open many opportunities for the future. She described vacation homes, investment portfolios, and a more modern lifestyle that Daniel deserved after years of helping his father at the company. Margaret noticed the confidence in Emily's voice, the quiet certainty that the next chapter of the Whitmore fortune had already been written. What Emily did not understand was that Thomas had spent the final months of his life studying people more carefully than balance sheets or market trends. He had quietly reorganized everything, moving assets into places that could not be accessed through simple assumptions or quick decisions made over breakfast conversations. Margaret remembered the afternoon he explained it all to her in his study, sunlight falling across the thick folders of legal paperwork as he calmly described why patience would matter more than any immediate reaction. Now, as Emily spoke about future plans and Daniel listened with tired acceptance, Margaret simply folded the newspaper and placed it beside her cup. She thanked Emily for her concern and said she would think about what had been suggested. Her voice carried the calm politeness of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between advice and ambition. Neither Daniel nor Emily noticed the quiet certainty behind her words. They only saw a widow who appeared tired, reflective, and perhaps uncertain about what came next. Margaret Whitmore allowed them to believe exactly that while the truth remained safely where it had been placed, waiting for the moment when patience would reveal more than any argument ever could. The following afternoon, the Whitmore house felt unusually active, even though the morning period had barely begun. Emily moved through the rooms with a sense of quiet authority, opening cabinets, checking drawers, and occasionally writing notes on her phone as if she were already planning the future layout of the property. Margaret noticed it all without saying a word. From the living room, she watched Emily measure the wide windows with a small tape measure she had found in Thomas' old workshop, then step back and study the walls as though imagining new colors and modern furniture. Daniel remained mostly silent, sitting at the dining table with his laptop open, occasionally nodding when Emily suggested changes or spoke about potential buyers who might be interested in a property of this size in Hartford. The house stood on nearly 2 acres of land, a rare piece of property for the neighborhood, with a long driveway lined with cedar trees that Thomas had planted himself when the company first became successful more than 20 years earlier. Margaret remembered those days clearly. Back then, Daniel was still in high school, and Emily had not yet appeared in their lives. Everything had felt simpler, built step by step with patience rather than expectation. Emily eventually walked into the living room carrying a folder she had taken from a desk drawer. She placed it on the coffee table and sat down with an expression that tried to look respectful but carried an unmistakable edge of anticipation. She explained that she had started organizing documents related to the house and the business because the next few weeks would require many decisions. She spoke about accountants, estate taxes, and the importance of preparing financial transitions quickly so that no opportunities would be lost. Daniel looked up briefly and said that his father would probably have wanted things handled efficiently. Margaret listened carefully to every word. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, fingers folded together as though she were simply reflecting on memories rather than evaluating the direction of the conversation. Emily opened the folder and spread several papers across the table, most of them old insurance statements and property records that revealed very little about the true structure of Thomas' finances. The real documents were somewhere else entirely, locked inside a safe deposit box at a downtown bank, exactly where Thomas had insisted they remain until the proper time arrived. Emily studied Margaret's face for a reaction, but saw only the composed expression of a widow who appeared thoughtful and tired. She continued speaking about practical solutions. She mentioned that moving Margaret to a smaller condominium might actually improve her quality of life and allow Daniel to focus on expanding the company without worrying about maintaining such a large property. Margaret nodded slowly, as though the idea sounded reasonable. She even thanked Emily for taking the initiative to organize the paperwork. But while Emily spoke with growing confidence and Daniel quietly supported the discussion, Margaret Whitmore remembered another conversation that had taken place months earlier in Thomas' study. She could still hear his calm voice explaining that wealth often revealed people more clearly than any argument ever could. He had smiled gently when he said that patience was sometimes the most powerful decision a person could make. Sitting there in the living room, surrounded by plans that had been made without her, Margaret realized that the first stage of that patience had already begun to unfold exactly as Thomas predicted. 2 days later, the house began to change in subtle ways that Margaret Whitmore noticed immediately. The quiet rhythm that had once defined the Whitmore home was slowly being replaced by a new kind of energy, one that felt less like mourning and more like preparation. Emily had started making phone calls from the dining room each morning, speaking in confident tones with real estate agents and financial consultants. Her voice carried through the hallways as she discussed property values, market timing, and renovation estimates that might increase the price of the house before a potential sale. Daniel listened to many of these conversations with a thoughtful expression, occasionally asking questions that suggested he had begun to imagine a different future for himself as well. Margaret observed everything from a distance, moving through her usual routines with calm precision. She watered the small garden behind the house, folded laundry that had accumulated during the busy days of the funeral, and prepared quiet meals that the three of them shared at the large oak table Thomas had built himself many years earlier. During dinner, Emily often spoke about possibilities. She mentioned a modern condominium complex about 15 miles outside the city where retirees could enjoy a peaceful lifestyle with community activities and easy access to medical services. She described the wide balconies, the private walking paths, and the convenient location near several shopping centers. Her words were always polite, but the message beneath them remained consistent. The Whitmore house, with its long driveway and nearly 2 acres of land, no longer seemed to have a place for Margaret in the plans Emily was quietly constructing. Daniel did not openly support every suggestion, yet he rarely disagreed either. Instead, he nodded slowly, sometimes adding that his mother deserved a simpler life without the burden of maintaining such a large property alone. Margaret listened to these conversations with the same composed patience she had shown since the day Thomas passed away. She asked a few gentle questions, thanked Emily for researching the options, and said she would consider everything carefully. But late that afternoon, after Daniel and Emily had left to meet a local real estate agent for coffee, Margaret quietly walked into the study at the far end of the hallway. The room still carried the faint scent of Thomas' old leather chair and the cedar shelves that lined the walls. She opened the top drawer of his desk and removed a small envelope that contained the key to the safe deposit box downtown. Inside that box rested documents that told a very different story from the one Emily believed was unfolding. Months earlier, Thomas had explained every detail with remarkable clarity. The business had been sold in a private transaction that few people knew about, and the funds had been placed into a carefully structured trust designed to protect the future of the family. Margaret had listened quietly that day, just as she listened now to the distant sounds of traffic beyond the garden. The plan had never been about secrecy for its own sake. It had been about understanding who would reveal their true intentions when they believed no one was watching. Margaret placed the key back into the envelope and closed the drawer gently. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn Thomas once cared for with such pride. She knew that sooner or later the moment would arrive when every assumption being made in this house would collide with the truth that had been patiently waiting just out of sight. The next morning began with a quiet tension that lingered in the air of the Whitmore house, like an unspoken agreement. Margaret Whitmore noticed it the moment she stepped into the kitchen. Emily was already seated at the dining table with a tablet in front of her, scrolling through photographs of houses and condominium buildings while sipping coffee from one of Margaret porcelain cups. Daniel stood near the window with his arms crossed, listening as Emily explained something about square footage, maintenance fees, and property taxes in different neighborhoods outside Hartford. When Margaret entered the room, Emily looked up with a friendly expression that felt carefully arranged. She greeted Margaret warmly and immediately began speaking about the meeting she and Daniel had attended the night before with a local real estate agent. According to Emily, the agent believed the Whitmore property could attract serious buyers very quickly because of the size of the land and the quiet prestige of the neighborhood. Emily described how several families had already expressed interest in homes nearby and how listing the house at the right moment could create strong competition among buyers. Daniel nodded as she spoke, occasionally adding that the money from a sale could open many new opportunities for the family. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down slowly across from them. She listened without interruption as Emily continued outlining a plan that sounded increasingly detailed. First, they would prepare the house for listing, then schedule professional photographs, and finally begin showing the property within a few weeks. Emily spoke with the calm confidence of someone who believed the decision had already been made. After a moment, she turned the tablet toward Margaret and showed her pictures of a modern condominium complex located about 20 minutes outside the city. The buildings were sleek and newly constructed with wide windows and landscaped walking paths. Emily pointed out the elevators, the community recreation room, and the medical clinic located only a few blocks away. She explained that many retirees enjoyed living there because it was peaceful and easy to maintain. Daniel added gently that he worried about his mother living alone in such a large house now that Thomas was gone. Margaret studied the photographs quietly. The buildings looked clean and comfortable, but they carried none of the memories that filled the rooms around her. She thought about the long summer evenings when Thomas used to grill in the backyard while Daniel played catch beneath the maple tree. She remembered the winter mornings when snow covered the driveway and Thomas would wake early to clear a path before the sun came up. All of those moments lived inside these walls. Emily watched Margaret's face carefully as she waited for a response. Finally, Margaret set the tablet back on the table and thanked Emily for researching the options. Her voice remained calm and thoughtful as she said she appreciated the effort. She added that moving was a very serious decision and she would need time to consider everything. Emily smiled politely, though the faint crease in her forehead suggested impatience. Daniel seemed relieved that the conversation had remained peaceful. None of them realized that Margaret Whitmore was not actually deciding where she might move. Instead, she was quietly observing how confidently they were building a future that depended entirely on an assumption that had never once been confirmed. 3 days later, the Whitmore house was no longer quiet in the mornings. Emily had begun treating the place as if it were already in transition, speaking frequently with contractors, agents, and financial advisors who seemed increasingly interested in the future of the property. Margaret Whitmore noticed the pattern without commenting on it. That afternoon, Emily returned from another meeting carrying a folder filled with printed documents and colorful brochures. She placed them neatly on the dining table and called Daniel over with an excited tone that echoed through the hallway. Margaret was sitting in the living room reading when their voices began to rise with animated discussion. Emily explained that the real estate agent believed the house could easily sell for several $1,000,000 if it was listed before the summer market slowed down. She talked about repainting the exterior, updating a few fixtures, and staging the interior rooms so potential buyers would immediately see the value of the property. Daniel listened carefully, asking questions about timelines and renovation costs, while Emily flipped through the pages in the folder. Margaret eventually walked into the dining room carrying a glass of water and took her seat quietly at the far end of the table. Emily looked up with a warm smile that felt slightly rehearsed. She explained that they were simply exploring possibilities and that nothing would happen without Margaret approval. Yet the stack of prepared documents suggested a different story. Emily then slid one sheet of paper across the table toward Margaret. It was a preliminary consultation agreement from the real estate agency, a simple document that would allow them to begin evaluating the house for listing. Emily spoke gently as she explained how helpful it would be if Margaret signed the form so the process could move forward smoothly. Daniel added that it was only an early step and that signing it did not mean the house would be sold immediately. Margaret studied the paper carefully, her eyes moving slowly across the lines of text while Emily waited with quiet anticipation. The room felt unusually still. Outside the wide windows, the late afternoon sun spread warm light across the backyard where the old maple tree cast its familiar shadow over the grass. Margaret thought briefly about the countless evenings she and Thomas had spent sitting beneath that tree, discussing the future of the company and the family they hoped would carry it forward with respect and patience. After a moment, she placed the document back on the table and folded her hands calmly. She thanked Emily for gathering the information and said she understood why they wanted to explore their options. Her voice remained steady as she explained that such decisions required careful thought, especially so soon after Thomas' passing. Emily nodded politely, though a hint of frustration flickered in her expression before disappearing again. Daniel looked slightly uncomfortable, but said nothing more. Margaret rose from the table, and walked slowly toward the hallway. Neither Emily nor Daniel realized that while they were planning how to divide the future, Margaret Whitmore was quietly waiting for the moment when the truth behind Thomas' final arrangements would make every assumption in that room collapse under its own certainty. The following morning arrived with a quiet gray sky hanging over the Whitmore property, and the house felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something inevitable to unfold. Margaret Whitmore woke early again and walked slowly through the kitchen, preparing coffee while the rest of the house remained silent. She carried her cup into the study and sat beside the large window where Thomas had once spent countless hours reviewing contracts and planning the future of the company. For several minutes, she simply watched the soft movement of wind through the branches of the old maple tree outside. Then she reached into her purse and took out her phone. The number she dialed had been written on a small card Thomas gave her months earlier, on a quiet evening when he had explained that there might come a time when patience alone would not be enough. When the call connected, a calm professional voice greeted her. It belonged to Richard Halston, the family attorney who had worked with Thomas for nearly 2 decades. Margaret spoke quietly, explaining that she believed the time had come to review the documents Thomas had prepared. Richard listened carefully and responded, with the calm confidence of someone who had expected this moment eventually. He suggested meeting later that afternoon at his office downtown, a tall brick building located near the courthouse where many of the city financial firms kept their legal offices. Margaret agreed and ended the call, placing the phone gently back into her purse. Upstairs, she could hear Emily moving through the hallway, her footsteps quick and purposeful, followed by the faint sound of cabinet doors opening in the kitchen. Within an hour, the house was active again. Emily began discussing another appointment with the real estate agent, explaining that the agent wanted to bring a photographer to capture images of the house for a potential listing presentation. Daniel seemed hesitant, but did not refuse the suggestion. Margaret entered the kitchen wearing a light coat and calmly informed them that she needed to drive into town for a few errands. Emily asked if everything was all right, her tone polite but curious. Margaret assured her that it was simply a matter of organizing a few personal things that had been delayed during the busy days of the funeral. Daniel offered to drive her, but Margaret gently declined and said the short trip would give her a chance to clear her mind. When she stepped outside, the air felt cool and steady, carrying the faint scent of rain that might arrive later in the afternoon. The drive into Hartford took less than 20 minutes, and Margaret parked in front of the familiar brick building where Richard Halston maintained his law office on the 4th floor. Inside the quiet office lobby, Richard greeted her with respectful warmth and guided her into a conference room where a thick leather folder rested neatly on the polished table. Margaret sat down slowly as Richard opened the folder and arranged several documents in front of her. The pages contained signatures, legal seals, and detailed financial summaries that represented the careful planning Thomas had completed long before anyone in the house began discussing the future of the Whitmore estate. Margaret read each page without speaking, her expression calm but focused. Richard finally looked up and said gently that once these documents were formally presented to the family, the entire understanding of the estate would change very quickly. Margaret nodded once, understanding exactly what he meant. For the first time since Thomas' passing, the quiet patience she had carried inside her began to feel less like waiting and more like preparation for a truth that was finally ready to be seen. Margaret Whitmore returned home just as the late afternoon light began to fade across the wide lawn behind the house. The familiar driveway curved gently through the cedar trees, and for a moment she sat quietly in the car before stepping out, looking at the home she and Thomas had built together piece by piece over so many years. Inside the house, she could already hear voices coming from the living room. Emily was speaking again with the same energetic confidence that had filled the house all week, explaining something to Daniel about scheduling the photographer and preparing the property for its first official evaluation. When Margaret entered the room, both of them turned toward her. Emily immediately asked how her errands had gone and whether everything was all right. Margaret removed her coat slowly and placed it neatly over the back of a chair before answering. She said the trip had been productive and that she had taken care of an important matter Thomas had arranged some time ago. Emily nodded politely but did not ask further questions, assuming the comment referred to routine paperwork connected to the estate. Instead, she began describing the meeting she had scheduled for the following morning. According to Emily, the real estate agent would arrive early with a professional photographer who specialized in luxury homes. They planned to walk through the entire property, take measurements, and discuss possible listing strategies. Daniel listened quietly as she spoke, occasionally glancing toward his mother as though uncertain whether the plan was moving too quickly. Margaret sat down across from them and folded her hands calmly in her lap. She thanked Emily for organizing everything and said she understood that many practical matters needed attention. Then she explained that before any decisions were finalized, there was something important that needed to happen first. Emily paused, her expression briefly puzzled. Margaret continued in the same gentle tone, explaining that Thomas had made several legal arrangements in the months before he passed away. Those arrangements, she said, required a formal review with the family attorney so that everyone would clearly understand the structure of the estate. Daniel straightened slightly in his chair when he heard the word attorney. Emily, however, appeared relaxed, assuming that the meeting would simply confirm the expectations she had already built her plans around. Margaret told them that Richard Halston had invited them to come to his office the following afternoon to review the documents together. Emily smiled politely and said that sounded perfectly reasonable. In fact, she added, it would probably help clarify the financial details needed for selling the property and reorganizing the family assets. Margaret nodded softly, offering no correction to that assumption. Outside the windows, the sky had grown darker as evening settled across the neighborhood, and the long shadow of the maple tree stretched across the grass just as it had every evening for decades. Inside the house, Emily continued discussing paint colors, staging ideas, and the strong market demand for properties like this one. Daniel listened quietly, but Margaret Whitmore simply watched them both with the calm patience that had carried her through the past several days. Tomorrow, she knew, would be the moment when every confident plan built on quiet assumptions would finally meet the truth Thomas had prepared long before any of them realized how important patience would become. The next afternoon, the air inside Richard Halston's office felt calm and deliberate, the way professional spaces often did when serious matters were about to be explained. Margaret Whitmore sat quietly at the polished conference table while Daniel and Emily took their seats across from her. Large windows overlooked the downtown streets of Hartford, where people moved through their ordinary routines without any awareness of the quiet turning point about to unfold inside that room. Richard Halston entered carrying a thick folder and greeted each of them politely before sitting down. His calm expression suggested that he had conducted many meetings like this during his long career, yet his tone carried a careful seriousness as he began to speak. He explained that Thomas Whitmore had spent considerable time preparing the structure of his estate during the final year of his life. These preparations, Richard said, were designed to protect the long-term stability of the family assets and ensure that the decisions Thomas made would continue to guide the future even after he was gone. Emily listened with relaxed confidence, her posture suggesting she expected a routine confirmation of the plans she had already discussed so many times at the Whitmore house. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his expression more uncertain as Richard opened the folder and arranged several official documents on the table. Margaret remained silent, her hands folded calmly while she watched the conversation unfold. Richard began by explaining that several months before his passing, Thomas had completed the sale of the manufacturing company he founded decades earlier. The transaction had been handled privately through a structured agreement that transferred the business to a larger national firm while preserving the financial value Thomas had built throughout his life. Emily's eyes brightened slightly when she heard this, as if the news confirmed the financial expectations she had quietly been planning around. Richard continued speaking in the same steady voice. He explained that the proceeds from that sale, along with several other investments, had been placed into a carefully designed trust fund that contained a total value of $28 million. The room became noticeably still. Daniel slowly looked toward his mother, clearly surprised by the number he had just heard. Emily remained silent for a moment, processing the information while the confidence she had carried for days began to soften into curiosity. Richard then placed one final document at the center of the table. He explained that Thomas Whitmore had assigned full control of that trust to a single trustee who would be responsible for all financial decisions connected to the estate. Emily straightened slightly in her chair, clearly expecting that Daniel's name would appear on the page. Instead, Richard calmly turned the document so everyone could see the signature line clearly. The name printed there was Margaret Whitmore. For the first time since the meeting began, Margaret gently lifted her gaze toward Daniel and Emily. Her voice remained calm and steady when she finally spoke. She explained that Thomas had believed patience revealed people more clearly than arguments ever could. She said that during the past week she had chosen to remain silent because she wanted to see what plans others might build when they believed the future was already theirs. Daniel lowered his eyes, realizing how quickly he had allowed assumptions to shape his thinking. Emily sat perfectly still, the confident plan she had described for days now fading into quiet uncertainty. Margaret Whitmore stood slowly from the table, her posture composed and dignified. The truth that had waited patiently behind her silence was now fully visible, and for the first time since Thomas passing the direction of the Whitmore legacy, rested exactly where he had intended it to be.